Richard Johnson is a lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University of London. He joins us now from Oxford. I have to start with JD Vance's comments. What do you make of what he just said?
I think they're very responsible. I mean, it almost sounds like it's an invitation for someone to have a shot at Kamala Harris. And this is really, I mean, the comments that both Vance and Trump have made about democratic rhetoric being responsible for these acts. I mean, first of all, we don't have any evidence from the investigations from the Butler County incident and assassination attempt in July, or the current one that is in fact the case. But also, I think it's a rather obvious but important point to make that neither Donald Trump nor JD Vance have exactly practiced what they preached in this regard in terms of toning down their rhetoric. And indeed, in fact, even in the comments that Trump made about calling for the Democrats to take responsibility for their rhetoric, he used inflammatory comments about Kamala Harris being a communist. So I think that this is really wildly irresponsible coming out, the language coming out of both JD Vance and Donald Trump on this.
It is a pot calling kettle black, that is for sure. Donald Trump, he has spoken of Democrats as being the enemy from within and the real threat. I mean, how does that differ to Democrats calling Trump a threat to democracy?
Well, I don't. I mean, I think actually there is a difference because the Democrats are pointing out that Donald Trump did not accept the outcome of the last presidential election, and Donald Trump attempted in the period after the November 2020 election for weeks to claim that the election had been stolen, had been rigged, when there was really no evidence of any kind of fraud or efforts to overturn to cheat on the election. Trump and his allies were lying, and I think we just have to say that they were lying about the outcome of the last election, and that I'm afraid is a threat to democracy. When you don't losers' consent is an extremely important part of any robust democracy. That I think differs from Trump when he makes comments about Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, where really he uses policy differences that he has with them to cast aspersions about their character or their patriotism. Which really I don't think he has any legitimate grounds to make those kind of claims.
Richard, considering the rhetoric in this toxic political environment, can these statements be interpreted as inciting violence if you're mentally unwell?
Well, I think one of the real challenges for us in the days to come after this attempt, which is different from July, is that the alleged perpetrator has survived, and also the alleged perpetrator has a much larger social media footprint. That will invite people, both in the media, but also people who are just online, to comb over this individual's life story and their comments and so on. And I would discourage that sort of activity. I think that the problem with doing that is it can lead to people with obscure, fringe, and dangerous views, sort of person who believes that shooting someone is a legitimate act in a democracy, getting too much attention, and can invite perhaps other people of that sort to think that one of the ways that they can get attention to their views is to engage in acts of violence. So I think there's a responsibility on all of us to try to not focus too much on the individual, even though, of course, there will be many reports in the days to come as well. So it's a difficult balance for the media on this.
Actually, I want to ask you about that, Richard, because I think it's fair to say that there is a responsibility of all candidates to bring down the temperature in their language and their rhetoric. But how can this be enforced, and what role does the media play in all of this?
This is also very difficult for the candidates. We're in a very febrile political environment. The United States is experiencing not just ideological polarization, but what we call in political science affective polarization. That is to say, an emotional polarization in American politics, where people view supporters of the other party, not everyone, but there's a growing proportion of people in the United States who view people who vote for a party different from them, not just as people who have a legitimate grievance, but people who are a threat to their country and their way of life. And this leads people to try to start to seek alternatives outside of the system. And so what I think is really incumbent, both on politicians and on the media and citizens in the United States and around the world, is to really focus on using the political system, using the democratic process to address your grievances, to air your grievances in a way that's responsible and measured. It can be passionate, but it can't look to actions outside of the system, particularly political violence or intimidation. There's been too much of that. Of course, the two attempts against Trump's life now, which are unacceptable, but we've also seen it with the plot against Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and Nancy Pelosi, which led to her husband being attacked with a hammer. And this sort of activity has to stop. And both yes. candidates need to say, cool it.
Enough is enough. Richard Johnson, we thank you for your time.